Welcome to the third Agro Lunch and Learn webinar of this 2018-2019 season. Hi everyone, my name is Laura McConnell. I work for Bayer in the Environmental Safety Department of the Crop Science Division, and I'm a member of the Agro Webinar Communications Committees. Before we begin, I would like to thank our longtime sponsor, formerly ABC Labs, who are now Eurofins Agri-Science Services, and without their support we would not be able to make these webinars freely available. So just a reminder that all agro webinars are recorded and are posted on our website for later viewing. So today we have a special webinar with multiple presenters from different organizations speaking on the topic of incorporating the benefits of vegetative filter strips into risk assessment and risk management of pesticides. And we are glad to welcome all the speakers today. First, we will hear from Moana Appleyard, who is a chemical review manager at the US EPA Office of Pesticide Programs in Washington, D.C. Our second speaker, Dr. Bob Lurch, who is a research soil scientist from USDA ARS. We have some difficulties getting him online, but we're hoping that he will be able to join. Next, we will have Professor Rafa Munoz-Carpena from the University of Florida, Hydrology and Water Quality Program. And finally, Dr. Jane Tang, who leads the Environmental Exposure and Assessment Team here at Bayer and the Research Triangle Park. These presentations today are abbreviated versions of those that have been presented earlier in the plenary session of a workshop that was held at NC State University. I'll be giving a few more details on that at the end of the talks. Each speaker will have approximately 15 minutes for their presentation, and we will take all questions at the end of all the presentations. And you can submit your questions anytime during the webinar via the chat feature, and then we will go through all the questions at the end of the webinar. So we expect this webinar to go a bit beyond our 1 hour typical time frame to approximately 1:15. One quick plug for the upcoming ACS meeting in San Diego. It's going to be held August 25th to the 29th this year. And it's a great venue. And just to remind you that abstracts are due by March 22nd. And there are agro student travel grants available, but you must submit your application also by the 22nd. So check out the agro website for more information. So now I would like to pass it off to Moana for her presentation.
Thank you, Laura. Again, I'm Moana Appleyard, and I'm going to give a brief regulatory perspective, opportunities and challenges in considering vegetative filter strips in pesticide risk assessments. Well-maintained vegetative filter strips are effective in reducing soil erosion, and according to USDA's conservation buffers to reduce pesticide losses, they're also effective in reducing pesticide runoff. And the EPA requires vegetative filter strips on many of our labels. However, our risk assessments do not currently quantify the transport reduction of those pesticides. So we've had vegetative filter strips as part of our mitigation toolbox for a while, and they are considered for pesticides particularly that bind preferentially to the soil. And they were included as part of the re-registration process on most of the pyrethroids that went through the process. And while we assume that they reduce pesticide runoff, it's difficult to quantify their effectiveness. And one of the issues is the potential variability in maintaining the vegetative filter strips. And as a result, the reductions of pesticides in water are considered qualitatively in our risk management decisions. And one issue we have is with FIFRA, we balance the risk management, considers the effectiveness and the cost. So we would need to make sure to have the vegetative filter strips be the most cost effective. And there are costs when you construct and maintain a vegetative filter strip, particularly for the farmers. Part of the crop is taken, part of the field is taken out of the production for the vegetative filter strip, and depending on the value of the crop and the size, this could run into hundreds of dollars per acre. So we'd want to make sure it's the most cost effective, and so it would be the most appropriate mitigation. So what we would look at for the driving factors of how the pesticide works in the environment, and first and foremost the pesticide properties with the chemical sorbed to the soil, and we'd also look at the application, the rates, method, and timing, and other environmental considerations and agronomic practices taking place on the land. Where could vegetative filter strips fit in our program? The agency has a tiered approach for our aquatic exposure assessments, and the vegetative filter strips could fit into those refinements. And one way to keep this consistent would be to use a modeling aspect. So if we consider going the modeling mechanistic route, we could either adapt our aquatic exposure models to incorporate vegetative filter strips, or look into a new model. Anyone who knows about model vetting in the agency, it is not a small effort. So looking forward, some of our goals would be to identify areas in the country where filter strips would be the most effective, and then to establish minimum removal efficiency that we could assume based on options like the width of the filter strip and the ranges of pesticide properties, among other things, and identify other agronomic practices that we could consider and evaluate. And more long-term goals would be to prioritize a peer review of this model so that we can include a quantitative use in our risk assessments, and continue to evaluate other erosion control tools in place of vegetative filter strips that are as effective possibly and cheaper, and better incorporate our other agronomic practices into our exposure modelings in an attempt to capture more real-world environmental concentrations, or EECs, that we measure, and also further understand USDA's Conservation Reserve Program, which is already reducing pesticide transport. And I'd like to thank you. This is our contact information.
Great. Thank you very much, Moana.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. And we really do appreciate the time that you've taken to present this today. And I hope we'll be able to continue to follow up on this and throughout this year and at the upcoming symposium at ACS.
Yes, we'll look forward.
Yeah. So we'll have some questions at the end for you, I'm sure.
Okay.
So next, what we'll do, since we don't have Bob Lurch online at this point, we will move on to Rafa Munoz-Carpena for his presentation. And Rafa, you can have a little bit extra time this time. So
okay.
Please feel free to take 20 minutes. Yeah, go right ahead.
Thank you very much, Laura. And I want to thank all the organizers for bringing me here today. I want to also acknowledge my co-authors, brothers in arms in this effort, Gary Fox from the North Carolina State University, Amy Ritter from Waterborne Environmental. And what I'm going to be talking about is looking at a mechanistic analysis of the behavior of vegetative filter strips to mitigate pesticides, identifying the important drivers in pesticide mitigation exposure. Let me bring up in full screen the presentation. Okay, so I want to start with this quote by John Muir, a famous naturalist, to set the stage. When we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. This is the common definition for what we call a complex system, one where we can indeed not understand everything that is inside or even how it's connected, okay? And pesticide mitigation through vegetative filter strips is indeed a complex system. It is the interface between a human component, which is ultimately the land use, the agricultural source area, crops being produced, rotations, and these are dictated by socioeconomic characteristics, market forces. Now we have the biological component, in this case, the vegetation characteristics, both in the source area, the cropping area, as well as the buffers themselves, the VFS, vegetative filter strips. And then finally, we have an integration of physical-chemical processes, which come at the interface between climate, hydrological processes, soil characteristics, and the chemical characteristics of interest. In all, we have potentially large number of processes, components, which are largely unknown. We have unknown interactions among these components, and these type of systems exhibit what we call emergent behaviors. Simply, we get surprised. It doesn't behave the way we expected, something went wrong, and it's ultimately an expression of the deep uncertainty that these complex systems have. So understanding that the mitigation of pesticides is a complex system, what can we do about it? Well, we can actually apply systems thinking, integrating these components. We can develop data, tools, strategies to capture this complex behavior. And very importantly, we can analyze the important factors that drive the system behavior. Realizing that there are many, can we really pick out the important factors through this dimension reduction that we call to develop management strategies around these important factors that influence the positive behavior of the system or reduce the risk, in this case, the runoff pesticide risk. So modeling to understand, reproduce, forecast, and control through management and planning the system behavior. That's the objective. And so one of the characteristics or factors that we can quickly come to think about when we discuss mitigation of pesticides by vegetative filter strips is the size of the buffer. So understanding size as the distance from the water body up into the land. This is the land taken by the buffer. You know, bigger, one would hope or would think is better. Here's an international review presented by Stefan Reckenberger in 2007. And what they did, they look at a broad range of studies that, when put together, indicate a certain insensitivity to the size of the buffer. So in this graph that we have here, you can see the size of the buffer as represented by the distance from the water body. And then on the y-axis, you have the pesticide reduction, the expected pesticide reduction as indicated by these studies. And you can see on those bars that there is a wide range. Pretty much any range can be expected for any buffer size, anywhere from 10 to 80, 70%, you know, somewhere with a median around 50. And so what this study indicates, by putting together so many different sources, what the study indicates is that there are other factors which are very important, and probably more so than the size of the buffer, that need to be considered to understand, predict the efficiency of these buffers. So what are we talking about? Well, the main processes that happen in the buffer, again, we have here depicted the vegetation between the water body and the land use, the source area. Essentially, the vegetation is going to increase the hydraulic resistance to flow and the infiltration of water on the surface compared to that of the field. Why? Well, there is dense vegetation, there are a lot of roots, there is organic matter. In time, that the soil aggregates, it has about an order of magnitude has been measured at times in permeability in that area. So these combined, the vegetation increase essentially reduces the velocity of flow. Velocity of flow is directly related to a reduction in, or actually deposition of sediment, and also infiltration reduces the amount of pesticide that might be dissolved in the infiltrated water. So together, the buffer reduces both liquid and solid phase, and the efficiency of that process will be very dependent on the characteristics that are underlying each one of these processes. So to be able to simulate in a mechanistic way these processes, BFS mod, the model we developed some years ago and we continue development, a vegetative filter strip modeling system, considers all these components. From the source area, here in the graph you see on the, where I put these grass stems, you can see on the source area to the left, the pesticide that comes in, the sediment that is coming in, the distribution between pesticide and sediment, in water and sediment, also the amount and variability of that water coming in, the rainfall, dilution effect, infiltration within the filter, and finally, how much of the pesticide is actually being trapped in the buffer, how much of that is being put out, and ultimately what is the degradation that happens to the residual pesticide after the event between two events. So I put there, it is not about just chemistry, okay? In fact, we have to be looking at all these interacting processes to determine the efficiency of the buffer for a specific field situation. So the model describes the system as the field source area, the inputs, the water, the hydrographs, sediment, the concentration of chemicals, in this case pesticides, then the processes of overland flow, infiltration, and sediment deposition, as well as interactions with the chemicals. Different conditions can be considered, including the presence of a shallower table as a limiting condition. And then ultimately we get on the downslope, on the water edge, we get the water, sediment, and pesticide reductions expected through those processes for that particular event. Now, what happens between two events is essentially that once the pesticide has been trapped on the surface on the sediment or infiltrated on the shallow part of the soil, what happens to that pesticide, how much of that might be available to the next event. That the model also looks at these processes of partitioning and degradation between events to identify the amount that is available for the next event in the series, the next rainfall runoff event in the series. BFS mod is a public domain model. It's freely distributed. It has documentation. It's actively maintained and in continuous development. There are lots of scientific publications, so for every one of the model components, and it can be downloaded. Just simply type Google VFS mod to get to it. Okay, so what we have been studying for a number of years, which is relevant to this presentation, is the integration of VFS mod within the current regulatory framework for surface water exposure, EPA PWC. Where essentially in the existing framework, the field component is dealt with by PRISM, and then the edge of the field, sediment, water, and pesticide is handed off to the water body in BVWM. Instead, we place a buffer in the middle through BFS mod, where the edge of the field is handed off to BFS mod. Processes of flow, infiltration, sedimentation, and pesticide reduction are calculated, and then the remainder is moved on to the BVWM, and then the comparison between with and without buffer is established. So typical outcomes from this analysis, in this case, we have, for example, in the left hand side, on the left column, on these 4 graphs here, you have two chemicals on top and bottom. We get on the x-axis the time for 30 years, PWC, EPA long-term exposure simulation, 30 years daily values. On the y-axis, you have the exposure concentrations in the aquatic body. And then you can see, for example, with and without buffer, those two lines. The upper line would be no buffer for a stable chemical, one that has a half-life of 10,000 days, which is an increment amount with every one of those pulses coming by every one of those events. With the buffer, you get a reduction with respect of that on acute effects. Now, on the second case, for example, where below that on the left, you get the labile compound, the one with 10 days half-life, and what you are seeing that some of the peaks are reduced more, some of them are reduced less. It will all depend on the specific event, the amount of chemicals, sediment, water coming for that particular event, where those efficiencies will be different across the different events, and overall, what might be the impact in the water body. All this information can be summarized in these nomographs that we have on the right-hand side on the top, where we present the size of the buffer versus expected reduction across a combination of pesticide characteristics, absorption, and half-lives typically. And on the bottom, we have a graph that essentially shows the type of data that you might expect under experimental conditions with a lot of spread. In this case, we present in the x-axis the amount of water moving through the filter, on the y-axis the pesticide trapping. And you can see this spread, two conditions there, two colors that you can see. One of them corresponds to a very small filter, another one to a large filter. And that spread actually is not experimental data in this case, but is simulation data, meaning that the model has sufficient richness in processes to capture mechanistically what otherwise we will assign to either experimental error or intrinsic variability of the natural system. So the important question in our mind is not do the buffers reduce the pesticide, the runoff pesticides? Instead, the important question that has been guiding our research for years is what are the factors that control the efficiency of buffers under a realistic field setting. So to do this, the framework we use to assess the relative importance of the factors, and again, the important concept here is to have in mind that we are doing a comparison when all factors are present. So to assess the real importance of a specific factor, you have to look at that factor in the context of all the other factors varying at the same time, affecting the process that we are looking at. So the way we typically handle this with the model is we have these input factors that describe the current condition that we are trying to describe. The model does all the calculations, and then it produces an output, which typically in this case will be the reduction in pesticide or sediment or water. Well, these input factors in the broadest sense are not just the parameters, characteristics that describe the system. They could also be the initial state, how much water there is in the soil, what is the residue in the system, things like that. But also the forcings, the boundary conditions we call them, for example, the rainfall, the hydrograph or amount of water coming from the field, the sediment coming from the field, and so on. And we know that under any given condition, there is a large variability at times in these input factors. We typically describe this variability in these input factors or these characteristics with these probability distributions. And then using a Monte Carlo framework, we can actually sample many, many times these distributions, multivariate sampling all at the time. And then we can run the model many times to produce these outputs, which describe the uncertainty of the expected outcome. In this case, for example, what is the expected range of efficiencies of pesticide reduction for a particular field setting. Now, this, of course, answers one question, which is what is that variability expected given all these intrinsic variabilities? So it propagates the input factor variability into the output. And then the next step would be, well, once we have that, what is driving that variability in the output? And this process we call the global sensitivity analysis, which essentially apportions the output variance into the input factors of the problem. So ultimately, by doing that, we can identify which one of these factors has the most effect on this variability in the output that we see there. So the one that has the most influence will be the important factor that controls the most that outcome. So we can answer these two questions: how much variability we are to expect on the efficiency of these filters, for example, for a long-term assessment of 30 years. What is, and then why and when is that variability, where is it coming from? What are the factors that are driving under that particular setting the variability? We use these graphs. I'm going to just present it very quickly because we'll see them later in the other slides. Here we have on the x-axis an indication of what we call direct effects, or simply every factor on its own, how much is affecting the output of interest. In this case, for example, the pesticide reduction. So by themselves, those input factors, the variability of those factors, how much is affecting these outputs. On the other hand, on the y-axis, we have the interactions of those factors with others. How much are those factors internally inside the processes of the system? How much do they need each other to affect ultimately the outcome? So what we get is a spread of the inputs of the problem into different groups, or somewhere in this map. And what we get is that factors away from the origin are more important. Factors that are higher on the y-axis have more interactions. Lower in the y-axis have mostly by themselves. Okay, so that's what we're going to be seeing in the next slides. With this framework and the modeling and the incorporation of PwC and VFS mod, then we can answer some interesting questions. For example, what are the common factors? So among hydrological, sedimentation, vegetation, chemical characteristics, which ones are the factors that drive the most this pesticide reduction? Or when there is a modification in the filter, for example, aging of the filter can introduce channels that bypass in part the flow moving through the channel, as opposed to the expected, the best condition that we hope for, which is water is moving smoothly across the buffers. Does that condition change the efficiency of the expected efficiency? Or does the timing of the application from pre-emergence or during the season, post-harvest, does that timing when considering the other variabilities of the system, is important in determining the efficiency of the buffer. What is the factors driving the residues in the buffer after an event, and what happens towards the next event? What factors are driving that? Or does the presence of a shallower table that sometimes is common in lowland areas, could that significantly reduce the efficiency of the buffer? I'm going to present a couple of these cases only. The channelization, the second one of these, what happens when a nice buffer gets, traversed by some water moving through in these small channels through, and also the presence of the shallower table to illustrate the analysis. So channelization, for example, we have in the top row a condition which is the design condition, a uniform shallow distributed flow across, where all the sedimentation and all the filtration happens across the buffer towards the water body. And what we can see in these graphs, again, remember on the left-hand side, the first column are these graphs I showed you before. The x-axis indicates the degree of importance of the factor, the first order, or if you want, by themselves, how much do these factors affect? And then on the y-axis, if there are any other factors that together with this one are actually affecting the other. So what we see on the top graph is the reduction of atrazine for this setting. This is an actual experimental setting that we use in evaluating this, where two experimental conditions had been assessed, a uniform versus a channelized flow. And then what we did is assessing for each one of these two conditions in the experiment, what might be the important drivers. And what we can see is that the inputs that are labeled there that are farther away from the origin towards the right, the first one is VKS, and that one represents permeability. Is the hydraulic conductivity, is the permeability, it's a soil characteristic. So on that circle on the top, we see the important factors, the most important factors belong to the soil. We can see that lower there written. So those are soil characteristics, where the second order of importance or other drivers are the chemical characteristics. Now let's go to the condition of channelized flow. The same filter, suddenly there is a 1/10 of the flow going through a small channel moving through. Okay, so what happens in that case? Well, now we start seeing a shift in importance in these drivers. So while the hydraulic conductivity, the permeability is still there, the soil infiltration still drives that. We can start seeing other factors that were not seen before as important determining the efficiency. For example, the sediment and vegetation characteristics, that DP factor there, the particle size, type of sediment that comes into the filter. We have others, which are the chemistry, which are now as important as soil, where before they were behind. So there is a shift in importance that we need to understand when the conditions change in these buffers. Now, for example, in terms of expected reduction in pesticide for this case, we see that on the top, we expect a 40 to 70% reduction. You can see on the second one of those graphs on the top. On the bottom, however, the introduction of channelized flow reduces significantly the expected efficiency from below 20%. So from 40 to 70% we had in the previous condition under uniform flow. Now we go down to 0 to 20%. And we now identify what might be the drivers of that efficiency between the 0 to 20%. Now, how about the shallower table, for example? In here, we have the same graphs on these four graphs that are together here. And what we see again is that those factors separated from the origin are the most important. The VKS, which is the permeability of the soil, again, stands out as being the infiltration. Ultimately, the infiltration process becomes the most important factor. But now that's the top row that we see there. So the first two graphs on the top row indicate a condition of no shallower table, okay, where there is essentially is very deep into the soil and is not affecting those surface processes. And now the lower condition indicates a case for the same locations. By the way, the two columns indicate two different eco-agrological conditions. One of them corresponds to flatlands with silty soils. The other one corresponds to slopey sands, a slopey land with sandy soils. One is wheat, the other one is grapes, in this case in France. And what we see is that indeed on the lower row, the second row is where the introduction of the presence of the shallower table was put in there. And now we can start seeing that the most important factor is that presence of the water table. And in the two cases, you have a slightly different effect because another factor, the permeability, is still important, where in the first one, permeability actually goes down, and it's really the variation of the water table that determines the efficiency. So if we see at the other graph, the final graph that we have on the right, you can see on the x-axis how deep the water table is. 0 corresponds to shallow water table at the surface. Deeper than that, towards 2 meters, is far away from the surface. And you can see on the y-axis how the efficiency, the reduction in flow, sediment, and pesticide changes. So what we are seeing is that we can expect with deep water table conditions, maybe 70% reduction. Under the presence of water table, we have 50% reduction, much lower compared to the previous one. And the main drivers are, of course, the presence of that shallow water table, the permeability in some of the cases, and then other factors. So we can analyze the relative importance of these factors. So having this in mind, and the processes that are built into this mechanistic, in the mechanistic model, and the framework within the PwC framework, one perspective would be how to address one of the questions that Moana indicated before, which is quantitative mitigation of pesticides. Is this possible? And we believe it is because of the evidence produced by the model and the comparisons with field studies, that maybe we could take a two-tier approach, an initial screening. The screening would be based on a subset of representative and contrasting EPA scenarios. Those could essentially could be analyzed to develop some nomographs, some early numbers in terms of what efficiency is expected as an indicator. And then on the basis of those results, then it could go into a second step, which would be refinement based on actual nested simulations of PwC to BFS-mod. The interface that could be created for this screening tool could be a pull-down, an interface with a pull-down menu where important factors that have been determined by the previous framework that we presented, the global sensitivity and uncertainty analysis framework, the factors that we identified as important for different settings will be the ones that the user can select, and then through a pull-down menu can select the combinations and then get these nomographs from the existing runs as a first indication of what might be the efficiency expected, and then later on move to the full coupled simulation system. So in summary, we propose a system-wide assessment of important factors controlling the efficiency of pesticide mitigation in buffers, and this, which is critical in risk assessment, we understand. We must move away from qualitative preconceptions of important drivers in favor of quantitative evaluations. This will lead to objective identification of important drivers that requires considerations of all the factors, not just individual factors, because the world works with all these factors together, back to John Muir and things being intrinsically connected to each other. We have to consider, very important, the in situ field characteristics. There is no way to generalize because every one of these characteristics is specific, to lead to realistic assessments of mitigation efficiency. And PwC BFS-mod modeling framework is suitable for a mechanistic quantification of pesticide mitigation within regulatory high-tier assessments. And then I want to leave you with the famous words of George Box, all models are wrong, some are useful. Hopefully we are at that point of usability of these models. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Rafa. That was a great summary of where we are with the modeling, which as you said, is a highly complex situation, but we have some great tools available to us. So I see now that we have Bob Lurch available online, and if he is ready, we can go to him next as a presenter, and he can talk about his research with measuring directly effectiveness of VFS.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Sorry, I got my time zones mixed up today. Of course, I was ready yesterday and not today. Sorry about that. Let's see, I need to share my screen.
You're already sharing your screen,
okay,
I believe. If you just
okay.
open your presentation, I think you're good to go.
Okay. Thanks so much. So my name's Bob Lurch. I'm a soil scientist with the USDA Agricultural Research Service stationed in Columbia, Missouri. Present some work that we have done with vegetative filter strips, measuring them in their ability to mitigate pesticides and runoff. There we go. So just a little overview of the presentation. I'll just give, and there's maybe been some discussion already on, what vegetative filter strips are and how they're used, but I got some pictures just to give you some concepts of what they look like and what they're used for. Then I'll move on to the research results, and then I'm going to finish with limitations of VFS, which I don't know if that's been discussed at this point, but we understand these things aren't a panacea, and there are some limitations, and we want to acknowledge that. So just a background, the filter strips, and somebody's probably already mentioned this, is that they're perennial vegetation that removes contaminants from runoff and overland flow. They're often, as this picture shows here, adjacent to a field, but I'll show some other settings. And what are they used for? Reducing soil erosion and preventing pictures like this one on the bottom. They trap contaminants in runoff, they improve soil quality, and they can enhance wildlife habitat when implemented properly. So some pictures here. Typical setting is the VFS on a filter or on a field border where it's a buffer literally between a cropped area and a stream. But we can be more creative, and there's some examples here. I think this is from Iowa, where there's contour strips of soybeans with native prairie grass, or grass buffers can be just one part of a bigger component in a stream corridor, riparian corridor restoration. So you can definitely have them in a lot of different contexts besides just the field border, but that's probably the most common. So our research approach and overall goal has been to assess the ability of VFS to reduce transport of pesticides in surface runoff and also to shallow groundwater, but I'm just going to talk about the runoff component today because that's a major issue and a major way by which pesticides and particularly herbicides are transported to water resources. So our approach is a two-part strategy. One is first using this perennial vegetation strip to alter the surface hydrology and hopefully retain the contaminant, trap it into the soil, and keep it from moving on to a nearby stream or lake. And then the second part of what we've pursued, and I won't present it today because of limited time, is once something's deposited in that buffer, if we have improvements in soil quality, then maybe we can enhance degradation, increase sorption, and decrease bioavailability. So there's a second component to it that once you trap it, then what? So we won't talk about that part as much today because it's really more about the hydrology and how effective are these things at reducing herbicide loads and runoff. So my particular context is the use of VFS for herbicide transport in runoff from clay pan soils, and I'll talk more about that. But they're particularly problematic, and so we really wanted to test their effectiveness of VFS in this setting. So we looked at grass species, buffer width, and also the time of year, the season effects, because we're dealing with a growing system, and there could be seasonality effects. Excuse me. We also want to quantify the retention mechanisms. How are these herbicides bound in the buffers? Is it infiltration? Is it absorption? Is it some combination of those two? And then we also developed some equations to predict herbicide load reductions. So the claypan soils is the major land resource area. 113 is called the Central Claypan area that encompasses northeast Missouri and south central Illinois. It's really an extreme form of what soil scientists call an argillic horizon. So it's a near surface soil horizon, but it has very high clay content, 40 to 60%, and it's high shrink swell, what we call smectitic mineralogy. So these soils, because of this near surface feature, it can basically, when the clay gets saturated, will prevent downward movement of water. So therefore runoff is promoted, and we have erosion, high erosion potential because we have silty textured soils. So that combination results in some very high pesticide transport and runoff, and I've documented over the years that we have some of the highest contamination of streams in the Corn Belt are occurring in this area here, and you see in the red in the lower graph the herbicide transport to streams, that the highest transport is generally in this area of these claypan soils. So our thought was if VFS can work on these soils, they probably could work anywhere because we have such poor infiltration. So we did a series of runoff studies. This is a rotating boom rainfall simulator, so these were replicated plot studies. We looked at 3 different types of vegetation. So we had tall fescue, we had a switchgrass hedge with tall fescue, and then we had native grasses that were mostly eastern gamma grass, Indian grass, and switchgrass. So the plots were 5 feet by 25 feet, 1.5 meters by 16, and therefore we tested the effects of the vegetation, buffer width, and then also season. And so the way we tested the buffer width, and this shows the control here, which was completely tilled, is that we have a source area that we sprayed with the atrazine, metolachlor, and glyphosate is the three herbicides we study in this case because they're the most commonly used in our region. And then we were able to sample at different points here at 0, 1 meter, 4 meters, and 8 meters. And of course, that perspective is kind of skewed on the picture, but we could sample throughout the buffer and therefore basically have different buffer source area to buffer widths by sampling up and down the buffer. And so there's some use to that, and I'll show you that. And then we did these experiments at different times of year, spring, summer, and fall. The simulated runoff was about 60 millimeters an hour, so a little bit more than 2 inches per hour. I think that translated to somewhere between a 1 in 5 year, 1 in 10 year event. And we did the event about 20 to 24 hours after application, so it's a rather a worst case scenario. We collected runoff samples from time 0 being runoff initiation at the 8 meter sampler, and then we sampled every 10 minutes over the next hour, and we analyzed both the water and the sediment. The grasses, for people that are always curious about the establishment and dates, the grasses were established in 2002. We have some poplar trees that I didn't show a picture of, and those were established in 2005. So the grasses have been there quite a while, and these studies I'm talking about were conducted from 2008 through 2012. So some results here, just to give you a sense of how these herbicides are transported, whether it's dissolved in water or whether it's bound to sediment. You can see that for atrazine and metolachlor, it's almost entirely dissolved phase, 99 and 96% respectively. And again, this is 20 to 24 hours after application, but about a third of the glyphosate's already sorbed at that point. In terms of magnitude, though, if we look at the relative loads, the implication of this dissolved phase transport is that on a relative basis, as a percent of applied, we lose a lot more atrazine and metolachlor to runoff, so somewhere between about 10 and 14%, whereas glyphosate's only about 2%. So that stronger sorption meant that we were having less of it come off of our source area. So this is what was entering the buffer. So you could just see the magnitude is about 5-fold difference between relative glyphosate loss and that of atrazine and metolachlor. So looking at each of the main factors here, we have the relative load here, the control is shown in brown, and then the different grass treatments. And in every case, for all three herbicides and for the sediment, we see significant overall reductions, around 50%, a little bit more than that for sediment on average. And it didn't make any difference what the vegetation type was. They were all effective, and they were all much better than the control. Buffer width also showed a consistent effect, which is this exponential decrease. Of course, at time or at the width 0 is 100%, and then we see a big reduction at 1 meter. It's a pretty good reduction at 4, but the difference between 4 and 8 was always small, and it was significant, but it was the magnitude of it was much less. So there's a diminishing returns aspect to that buffer width that we'll talk more about. Seasonality was a pretty minor effect. We had a slight effect with atrazine and metolachlor due to the warm season grasses reducing infiltration a little bit more during the summer, but relatively minor effect. So here's one of the things we did is looking at load reductions in buffer width and just doing a regression analysis showing that for all the different grass types, we see the strong exponential decay or first order model as far as load reduction goes as a function of buffer width. You could have actually, for the controls, used a linear model. But what's interesting here is that regardless of the grass species, and really even the differences between glyphosate and atrazine, the equations were very similar in terms of the different parameters and the coefficients. They're all quite similar. So you could almost come up with a universal equation regardless of the mode of transport, whether it's dissolved phase or sediment bound. And that's also a consistent finding with other VFS studies, and I'll talk about that too. So this exponential decrease in contaminant load, we also see that with runoff, where the red line here is the control, and there is some decrease because you're getting some infiltration along that control, but we see this exponential decline in runoff for the grass treatments, and then very much so for the sediment. We actually get erosion, you get an increase on the control because we're getting erosion, but we see this exponential decline in sediment load as a function of buffer width. A prior study done on the same plots after they were established, I believe this study was done in 2003, so the treatments were pretty new, looking at various forms of phosphorus and nitrogen, and again, we see this exponential decrease. We see that the buffers are very effective, getting anywhere from 50 to 80% reductions in load. So a very common theme across not just our study, but other studies, but also across contaminants, whether that's sediment, nutrients, or herbicides. So one useful implication of this is we can take our data, and this is example is metolachlor, and we can recount this x-axis instead of buffer width. We know the source area that we sprayed, so we can recount it as the source to buffer area ratio, or the S-bar. And we can look at kind of the reality of where we might be in a field setting, because we might not even be at 8 to 1. We certainly aren't going to be at 2 to 1 in terms of land taken out of production. We're not going to have source areas of 2 to 1. Even though we would certainly benefit from an environmental standpoint, it's not practical to take that much land out of production. So we can use these to interpolate and say, well, if we're in this 10 to 20 to 1 range, what kind of reductions might we expect versus, say, 50 to 1? And you can see here, 50 to 1, you're only going to get 7 to 8% load reduction, regardless of which of these 3 grass treatments it is, whereas you're going to get closer to 20% for an S-bar 20 to 1, and more like 30% for 10 to 1. So we really want to be at least in this 10 to 20 to 1 range for the width of the buffer relative to its source drainage area to really be effective in terms of load reduction. Retention mechanisms. How are these pesticides retained in the vegetative filter strip itself? Shows the results here for atrazine, metolachlor, and glyphosate. And we've got infiltration on the left side and absorption on the right side, and we see a significant increase for each of the grass treatments in infiltration compared to the control, and around 20%, a little bit, 15–20% of the load was retained in the buffer by infiltration. When we look at absorption, again, significant increases generally compared to the control, with the exception of glyphosate, in that we absorbed probably between about 20 and 30% of that load, so even more than what was retained by infiltration. But we do see some differences in the grasses here that we didn't see with infiltration, where the tall fescue actually seems to outperform the other 2, particularly the native, with respect to absorption. And this might be the fibrous root system does a better job of retaining the material, slowing down the flow, causing more interaction with the plant material and the soils, perhaps. So that was an interesting finding there. But point being is that both mechanisms were at work, and they're both significant. Absorption accounted for the larger proportion, particularly in the grass treatments, 23 versus 18. In the control, most of the retention was by absorption. And because both mechanisms are at work, we think that's why we see similar results in terms of load reductions with VFS for both dissolved phase and sediment bound, because we have both these mechanisms happening, and they're both capable of trapping these different types of transport modes. So summary, vegetation, all the grass treatments significantly reduced herbicide transport, and we really didn't see much difference other than absorption, where tall fescue is a little bit better for that. Buffer width, we see this exponential decrease in load with increasing buffer width. And really, for effective load reductions in a field setting, we need that S-bar, source to buffer area ratio, to be 20 to 1 or less, or we're really not going to have very much effectiveness, at least not for herbicides. So, season had minor impact, suggesting that regardless of whether you choose warm season or cool season, at least in our climate, you're going to get good performance. The retention mechanisms, both absorption and infiltration, were important, but one significant thing here is that absorption was the bigger of the 2, and it's going to occur even when infiltration becomes limited, which I'll talk more about. But that becomes a limitation, is that at some point you have saturation and you're not going to get more infiltration, but you do get absorption. So that's important finding. And we showed that these VFS are very effective for reducing herbicide loads and runoff from clay pan soils, which we would argue is a near worst case scenario. So if they're effective in this context, they should be very effective in other soils that have better infiltration. So the limitations on hydrology, and I've alluded to that, is that infiltration ceases once the thing becomes saturated, but we know absorption at least does occur. Concentrated flow is probably the biggest way to undermine the effectiveness of these things. If we have gullies leading from the buffers or into the buffers, they're going to just reduce the effectiveness greatly, bypass most of the absorption and the infiltration benefits. Subsurface flow, which in some settings can occur, obviously is going to bypass flow. And VFS are obviously not going to be suited to tile drain areas where we, by design, are creating subsurface flow. Landowner considerations, the biggest one being land is removed from production in order to put one of these in. Not all sites are appropriate. The NRCS guidelines would require that the maximum slope be not greater than 5%. One's going to have to make decisions about the plant species, and a lot of those are going to be practical. Do you have seed that's available? Which things are easiest to establish, etc. And you may have limitations on use. Maybe you can't drive over them. You maybe not be able to graze. You do have to maintain, and you're going to have to do something in terms of mowing. Grazing, I think, is usually requires some specific permission. So usually mowing or burning. You got pest control. You got to control erosion in the source field itself, where you're going to overwhelm your buffer, and you need to maintain sheet flow conditions into it, as I mentioned. So with that, I'm done, and I suppose we're going to do questions at the end.
Yes, that's right. Thank you very much, Bob, for reminding me to mention to the audience that we will be taking questions at the end of all the presentations. And if you look on your control panel, you can see a chat feature, and that is where we would ask that you submit your questions, and you're welcome to submit them at any time. If you have something come up while you're watching, you can go ahead and type that in, and then we'll have those ready during the question and answer period. So we do expect to be finished approximately 1:15, just to give you an idea. So next we will hear from the industry perspective, Dr. Jane Tang.
Okay, so in the next 15 minutes, I will talk about the industry perspective on vegetative filter strip incorporation in pesticide risk assessment. So it's a common goal of regulatory agencies and the registrar to consider VFS benefit in risk assessment, as you have already heard from Anna. And this effort need to be driven by multiple stakeholders and their collaborations. So there are three important components to support this goal. First, field data to demonstrate VFS is effective in pesticide mitigations. ARS, academia, and registrar have generated a lot of data over the years. And second, models to quantify the VFS benefit. In the past decade, significant advancement in pesticide modeling was made by academia, ARS, and the registrar. The third component is implementation and sustainability of VFS. So grower adoption is very important. RICS, university extensions, and registrar can work together to achieve this goal. I will walk through these areas in the following slide. First, data to show effectiveness of VFS. As you already seen from Bob's presentation, there are field data generated by ARS, and there are also other data available. And an industry-supported literature review published in 2010 included about 300 individual test results for 30 pesticides and metabolites. A latest study published last year compiled data for model evaluation, also included about 250 individual test results for 18 pesticides and metabolites. So there are a huge amount of data available for pesticide. So we developed a cumulative distribution of pesticide mass removal for both data sets. As you can see, the median mass removal was in the range of 65% to 85%. The message here is VFS is effective for pesticide removal, demonstrated by this large number of data. Next, I will talk about models to quantify VFS effectiveness and how they can be applied in risk assessment. Mechanistic models available to estimate pesticide removal, and they have been really expanded from nutrient models to pesticide in the past 20 years. APEX, that's developed by Blackland Research and Extension Center, PRISM BUFF by Waterbound Environmental, SWOT, it's ARS model, and SWOT is based on the buffer part is based on VF-SMART. RAM by ARS, this model focus more on repairing buffer zones. And VF-SMART, that you have already heard that model from Rafa. And VF-SMART is specifically designed to evaluate VFS effect. In around 2000, CLA sponsored research to evaluate all the above models except SWOT, because SWOT was based on VF-SMART. The buffer component was based on VF-SMART, and the model evaluation showed that VF-SMART performs best in uncalibrated simulation mode. So after that evaluation, the further research from industry will mainly based on VF-SMART. The details of this evaluation can be found in the reference I put there on the slide. This slide and next slide about evaluation of pesticide trapping efficiency equations used in VF-SMART. So I don't have time to go into the details of these equations, but I just want to point out that the reduction of pesticide load is a function of total inflow and incoming sediment load, clay content, and phase distribution coefficient. So that's all the initial regression equations developed in 2009. And based on the data at that time available, is about 47 data points. And last year, this equation was recalibrated using a larger data set, which is the data set I mentioned, including 244 data points. And there a new approach also developed using mass balance approach. Mass balance approach is a semi-process based model. Currently, this approach are all incorporated in VF-SMART. So the graph showing on this slide show the comparisons of measured pesticide reduction versus predicted pesticide reduction for the two equations. One is a regression equation using the large data set. The other one is a mass balance approach. And that you can see that model really predicted the mass reduction well. And with the Nash Sutcliffe efficiency of 0.82 for regression equation and 0.74 for mass balance approach. The advantage of mass balance approach is that does not need regression parameters. Now, how can VF-SMART be used in risk assessment? Rafa already talked about the integration of VivaSmart with regulatory models using existing EPA PMRA standard scenarios for long-term simulations. Another approach could be develop mass loading reduction factors using VivaSmart for representative hydrological conditions and chemical types, and incorporate these factors as a higher tier refinement option. All this approach are technically feasible, and it's just depend on how we want to use the model. Now, I want to shift from a data and a model in general term to a particular topic of interest. Is VFS effective for water-soluble compounds? It is well understood that VFS is effective in removing sediment and sediment transported compound. But effectiveness of VFS for water-soluble compound is not well accepted. However, as you can see from Rafa's slide, that the VFS reduced pesticide offset transport mainly through two mechanisms: infiltration and sedimentation. And a correct term to describe the chemical property, which is important to VFS effectiveness, is KOC rather than water solubility, because KOC determines chemical partitioning between water and sediment phase. Infiltration is a dominant process to return water-soluble compound, and is controlled by soil and rainfall properties. Therefore, pesticide trapping efficiency is event-based and dynamic. And the studies that you see from Bob's presentation also showed that VFS is effective for both soluble phase and adsorbed phase. All those processes can be simulated using VivaSmart. So to look at the effectiveness of VFS for water-soluble compound, we divided the data set that I mentioned, which has 244 data points, into two categories by pesticide properties. One category is KOC greater than 1500, and the solubility is less than 1 ppm, and another category is KOC less than 1500, and solubility is greater than 1 ppm. As you can see from the box plot here, for individual event-based trapping efficiency and experimental conditions, there is no statistical significant difference observed on the median of the two categories. So from the individual field studies that Bob showed to the large data set, there are no real significant difference you can see from this water-soluble compound compared to less water-soluble compound. So back to the factors control the VFS efficiency is really multiple factors. Chemical is one of the factors, but hydrological and soil properties are also very important. And this graph you have seen from Rafa's slide, but what I want to point out is the variabilities of VFS efficiency in long-term simulations for water-soluble compound. And this is the two buffer widths presented here on the graph. One is 1.5 meter, the other one is 9.1 meter. Graph here is percent pesticide reduction predicted by VivaSmart versus total rainfall and runoff for pesticide with a KOC of 100 for 30-year long-term simulations using EPA Illinois corn scenario, which has a clay loam soil. And you can see that VFS is less effective in extreme rainfall event due to limited infiltration in saturated soil. Therefore, antecedent soil moisture condition is a very important factor for compound with low KLC. Now the last component, registration. Registrants support VFS implementation and maintenance because they are very important in maintaining the VFS functions. So filter strips must be properly installed and managed to maintain performance, to minimize concentrated flow and promote infiltrations. And their literature indicated that performance of well-managed filter strips generally improve over time. And if you see the time span from 1 year to 10 years, and after filter strip is established, and the performance improves. And industry is willing to contribute to the stewardship initiatives to have education workshops with growers and collaborating with university extensions and also NRCS. There are definitely a lot to do in these areas to enhance buffer maintenance. Okay, so here is my last slide for conclusion. Working with stakeholders, industry supports the adoption and the use of properly installed and maintained vegetative filter strip as an effective risk-based mitigation measure for limiting offsite movement of pesticide. And models are available to reasonably predict VFS effectiveness. So approach can be developing loading reduction factors using VFSmart or integrating the model into the current risk assessment framework. Thank you for your attention, and I also want to recognize my Bayer and industry colleagues for your review and comments on this presentation.
Thanks very much, Jane, for that presentation. Did a great job, as did all the presenters. Yes, let's show my screen. All right, so let me just go back to the workshop that was the start of all of this discussion, and that was a workshop held last December, the 2018 workshop on innovation and regulation in agriculture. And we had the workshop with the same title as this webinar that was hosted by the new NC State Center of Excellence for Regulatory Science in Agriculture. And you can see we had quite a large group for the workshop, and we had a number of plenary speakers, including the ones that presented here today. Just wanted to let you know that the workshop didn't end with just the last day of the workshop. We have formed some teams, work teams based on the priorities that were set by the workshop groups. And so throughout 2019, these teams will be active and working together in a multi-stakeholder fashion, which is the purpose of the Center of Excellence, which is to bring the various stakeholder groups together. One team is working on really a functional definition of vegetative filter strips, because there's lots of different definitions around different agencies. Team 2 will be working on a literature review, and basically has 4 sub-teams that will address various aspects related to VFS. Team 3 is looking at the value case for growers, and this is really important if we're going to have widespread adoption of VFS across the landscape. And Team 4 is looking at more of the technical modeling aspects to conducting a tier risk assessment with VFS mod or other modeling tools. And so just wanted to let you know that we're also going to have a symposium at the San Diego ACS meeting this fall. So please submit your abstracts if you've been doing research in this area. We'd love to have you join us, and we'll have further discussions in person there at the ACS meeting. So now I will call up the questions that have come in from the audience and direct those to the panelists. So the first one I will provide is a short question, and this is, are state regulatory agencies, for example, CDPR, incorporating VFS models into risk assessments? We don't have anyone from CDPR on the line, but maybe one of the panelists is aware of that. Moana, do you have any idea?
I can't speak for the states. I do believe that California, I think they do have some kind of review, but I personally am not in touch with them about that. So I could look into that if you want to send a question to me by my email, and I can follow up with it.
Great, thank you. Okay, the other question I got is a long question, and essentially has some concerns about saying that the science in the real world does not support the proposed use of buffers in regulatory modeling. And so there's several issues that she'd like to have addressed. The first one, it says, in the real world, ag buffers are not engineered systems, and there's little or no maintenance of them, so they work poorly. So I wonder, maybe Bob, you could mention that or address that, since you sort of had some comments on that aspect in your talk.
Yeah, I don't think I have a very good sense of when they're put out, how well they are, or how effective they are. I will say, just in my own experience, most of the buffers we see are not necessarily ones paid for through NRCS, so they're usually put in by the growers, and they have their own motivations. Sometimes it's an area that floods frequently, and so they do that. So are they effective because, or are they ineffective because people don't maintain them? Well, clearly if people don't maintain them, they will become ineffective. If you don't do something to control the soil that's going to accumulate on the upslope side, and occasionally break that through so that you don't get concentrated flow around it, if you don't do things in the field itself to prevent it, absolutely these things will get gullied right through and become totally ineffective. So maintenance is key to how effective they are. I don't think that, well, I don't know. I mean, I guess my own experience, I've never sold it on anything other than that, because you do not put these things out there and then they just work for 10 years or 20 years without maintenance. That's simply not the case.
Rafa, did you have any comments?
Yeah, as I presented on my slides, one of the cases at the end, the effect of this channelization, or getting these reels through the buffers, for the particular experimental case that we tested, we did the simulations for, the expected efficiencies under the best scenario of a well-maintained buffer, and those match the measurements down in the field, were in the order of 40 to 70% reduction in pesticides. But when a channel was built through, which essentially accounted for about 1/10 of the flow going through, those efficiencies went from these 40 to 70% expected to about 0 to 20%. So indeed, the lack of maintenance of these buffers and eventually the formation of these channels through will greatly reduce the effectiveness. So again, a call to arms to, they are not just things to be put out there and forgotten about, but rather that they have to be actively maintained, mowing, frequent mowing that enhances the density of that vegetation, the disposal of those clippings for nutrient, so that there are no nutrient accumulations. that requires, and then eventually, when the major event comes along, they will be overburdened. I mean, a lot of sediment might be moving from the field, and then these buffers will be essentially, they will collapse, they will be flooded by the sediment. And then what growers that keep an eye on these things do is they will have to reseed it, re-level it, reseed it, and restart it, and that's active management of these buffers. So I think it's a very important question that we need to understand also the quality of those buffers to really assign any efficiency to them.
Another part of the question is about tile drains, and saying that they're perhaps not effective in fields that are tile drained. Would anybody like to address that?
Yeah, I mean, clearly because by design they wouldn't be effective. In fact, I have actually seen the ludicrous situation in which a vegetative buffer that was 60 feet wide was built in a field that was tile drained. And therefore that buffer never had runoff because all the runoff from that field is going subsurface and into a ditch. So that's another aspect of the effectiveness is the design. Sometimes these things are put in absurd places, and tile drained areas generally speaking don't have runoff by design, and therefore buffers are not going to be useful.
Okay. What about, it says also, labels do not clarify in sufficient detail the buffer requirements. What I've seen is a well-maintained buffer on the label for some compounds.
Yeah, this morning I can speak to that. We are always trying to improve our label clarity. It is, and we welcome suggestions from industry to help us, who are in touch with the growers, that can make it as clear as possible. So it's a constantly, it's an attempt from us to improve how clear it is on the label and how it works for people.
Yeah, it seems to me that, okay, go ahead, sure.
Sorry, Laura. I would just add that, oh gosh, I lost my train of thought now. I was just trying to think of what.
About recommendations from NRCS?
Oh, yes, that's where I was going to go with that. Thank you. Is that when you put these in, if they're cost shared, there is very specific maintenance requirements, at least on NRCS's part, as far as what they recommend for that type of grass, et cetera, in that setting. So I think even if the buffer, or even if the label is vague about what maintenance means, it is well defined if it's a cost shared one. Now, if the farmer's just simply putting it out there on their own, then maybe they don't have a strong concept of what a well-maintained buffer is. But I think there is a good definition of that, and I think that NRCS has a good handle on that.
Yeah, I think, I would say from my perspective, there's no downside to encouraging producers to use vegetative buffers, vegetative filter strips. And I think, of course, you're going to have some that are going to fail, and some years you may do a better job of maintaining them, but it may be that if we have more and more of these installed across the landscape, I think there can be a significant improvement in water quality in those areas. And so I think that's why this workshop included people from NRCS in quite good participation from NRCS in this the workshop that we had, and definitely will take participation from and advice from NRCS. That's really their expertise, is maintenance of buffers and installation of these types of things. So there's another question from Don Walkup. Bob Lurch, were the VFS under rainfall simulator with the treated plots?
Yeah, they were. Everything was rained on, because I've seen studies where people have only rained on, say, the source area where they sprayed, and that just didn't make sense to us because that didn't seem anywhere close to a real world recreation. So yeah, the entire area that was sprayed, which was the upper half of these plots, so that was 8 meters, and then the lower 8 meters that actually had the grass buffer, or in the case of the control was tilled, the whole area was rained on. That's a good question, though. Thanks.
I don't see any additional questions in the system at this point. I'll give you a few seconds if you have additional questions to type in. If not, I think we will end the webinar for today. I'd like to thank our 4 speakers for their time and effort in putting these presentations together. I'll remind the audience that this webinar is recorded and will be made available on the AGRO website within a few days. And we hope you'll join all the future webinars that we have scheduled for the rest of the year. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Laura.